My children told me, "Dad, stop calling us. We have our own lives. You need to stay on your own and figure it out." So I did exactly that. I stopped calling them, and I called my lawyer instead. Weeks later, when they desperately tried entering my estate, my newly hired private security escorted them out. I am Gerald. I just turned 71 years old. A retired architect by trade, I've spent my whole life raising foundations in concrete and in love alike. Home is a 15-acre estate in Western Virginia, hill country. A place I grew up and built, with my own two hands side by side, with my late wife Lorinda. She left this world 5 years ago, and since that day the quiet inside this sprawling mid-century modern house has been the one thing I could count on. On the evening of my 71st birthday, I sat alone at the custom-built walnut dining table. The afternoon had been spent preparing a pot roast and buttered rolls, clinging to the hope that my children might remember the date and walk through that front door. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along so you never miss the next one. While you're settling in, I'd love to know, are you driving somewhere, sitting down with a cup of something warm, or maybe just resting after a long day? Drop it in the comments and keep me company. A quick note before we begin, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. It's the truth inside the story that matters most. The mantel clock chimed in the hallway, every toll a sharp reminder of the empty chairs surrounding me. I picked up my phone and dialed my son, Brennan. He is 38 years old, a serial entrepreneur, perpetually chasing the next big startup while drowning in the wreckage of his failed ventures. The call went straight to voicemail, so I dialed my daughter Nadell. She is 41, a real estate agent living well beyond her actual means, forever straining to impress a high society crowd she has no real business running with. To my surprise, the line clicked, and both their voices came through at once. They had merged the calls. "Happy birthday to me," I said, pressing a cheerful note into my voice that I didn't quite feel. "Are you two still coming over for dinner? I made the roast you both used to love." A heavy sigh rolled through the speaker. Behind it, I could hear the clinking of cocktail glasses and the low murmur of a busy restaurant. They were out together without me. Brennan's voice cut through, first wrapped in pure, unfiltered irritation. "Dad, we put you on speakerphone because we're both really busy right now. We have a dinner reservation with some important clients." Before I could ask why no one had told me our plans were canceled, Nadell stepped in. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, stripped of any warmth. "Dad, stop calling us. We have our own lives to manage. You need to stay on your own and figure it out. We are not your babysitters." The line went dead. Click. I sat there in that vast, echoing dining room with the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I looked around the beautiful home Lorinda and I had built together. We had poured our blood, sweat, and tears into giving our children a perfect life. But in that moment, a devastating truth settled over me. My children did not see a grieving widower reaching out for connection on his birthday. They saw a persistent nuisance. They saw a burden. I did not cry. I am an architect. When a structure shows signs of critical failure, you don't weep over the cracks in the drywall, you inspect the foundation. And what I found was that my family's foundation had rotted clean through. Rather than sinking into self-pity, I pushed back from the table, the pot roast and buttered rolls sitting untouched, and walked down the hall to my private study. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up my secure banking portal. For years, I had run a series of quiet automatic transfers to keep my children afloat. Between Brennan's failing ventures and Nadell's appetite for luxury living, I had been funneling $12,000 a month into their accounts without a word. I never held it over them. I simply wanted them to have a safety net. As I scrolled through the outgoing transfers, a flashing red notification caught my eye, an urgent alert from the bank's fraud prevention department flagging an inquiry on the deed to my estate. My brow furrowed. I opened the secure message and my blood turned to ice. Brennan and Nadell had jointly submitted an application to leverage my 15-acre estate as collateral on a $500,000 commercial bridge loan. I pulled up the attached documents and stared at the screen in absolute horror. There at the bottom of the authorization forms was my digital signature, a flawless forgery. They had bypassed my primary email, intercepted the verification codes, and executed the documents counting on my age to mean I'd never look. They assumed I was a senile old man who would never think to check his secure portals. someone who would quietly lose his home when the bridge loan collapsed. The audacity of it was suffocating. They had just told me to stay on my own and figure it out while simultaneously trying to steal the very roof over my head to bankroll their reckless lifestyles. This was not merely disrespect. This was felony fraud. I sat in the blue glow of that screen for a long time, the betrayal burning through my chest like a slow fire. Then a cold, absolute calm took hold, the kind that only arrives when you understand a relationship is finished, and there is nothing left worth saving. I downloaded the forged loan documents. I pulled years of bank statements showing the monthly allowances. I assembled every piece of evidence into a secured, encrypted folder. Then I picked up my phone. I scrolled to Brennan's contacts, his college graduation photo, grinning back at me. I deleted it. I scrolled to Nadel's, a shot of her laughing in the backyard of this very house. I deleted it. I did not call my children to argue. I did not demand explanations. I scrolled to the letter W and pressed dial. 2 rings, then a gruff and familiar voice. "Clifford," I said, my voice level, empty of feeling. "It's Gerald. I need to sever some dead weight and I need to buy a gate." The next morning, the sun climbed over the rolling hills of Western Virginia hill country and stretched long shadows across my property. I dressed in a sharp-tailored suit I hadn't worn since Lorinda's funeral, then drove 2 hours into Richmond, pulling up to a glass tower where my longtime attorney, Mr. Clifford, commanded the top floor. Clifford is a man in his late 60s, a ruthless, razor-edged legal mind, who has handled my professional affairs for 3 decades. He met me at the boardroom door, took one look at my face, and needed no explanation. I opened my briefcase and laid the paperwork across the polished mahogany table. I showed him the forged loan applications. I showed him the IP addresses confirming the submissions had come from Brennan's corporate technology office. I showed him the paper trail of the $12,000 monthly allowance I had been quietly providing for years. Clifford reviewed everything without a word. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hard. "Gerald," he said quietly, "they crossed a line you cannot uncross. This is federal wire fraud. I can have them in handcuffs by tomorrow morning." I shook my head. "No, Clifford, putting them in jail is too easy. If they go to prison, they become victims in their own minds. They'll blame me for destroying their lives. I want them to face the exact reality they demanded from me. They want their own lives. They want me to stay on my own. I'm going to give them precisely what they asked for by cutting off every single resource they've been living on." We spent the next 4 hours building a brutal, airtight legal strategy. Clifford began initiating immediate freezes on all joint accounts and halting every automatic transfer. But there was another layer to my plan, one my children were completely blind to. They believed my wealth was tied up solely in the house and my standard retirement accounts. What they never knew what I had kept hidden for over 20 years, so they would value hard work over inheritance, was that I didn't just own the 15 acres beneath my home. Years ago, anticipating suburban expansion, I had quietly acquired the commercial zoning rights to the surrounding 50 acres of prime real estate. I was sitting on a gold mine worth millions in empire, assembled in the total silence. They thought they were stealing a house. They had no idea they were throwing away a kingdom. We finalized the paperwork. Clifford looked at me with a mixture of respect and solemn understanding. "Are you sure you're ready for the fallout, Gerald? When the money stops, they are going to come for you." I stood buttoned my jacket and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at Richmond spread below. "Let them come," I said. "I am the architect. I built their lives, and I know exactly how to demolish them." The quiet hum of city traffic far below felt utterly disconnected from the financial execution taking place in that room. Clifford didn't hesitate. With the practiced efficiency of a man who had dismantled corporate empires, he began severing the lifelines my children had long taken for granted. First came the block on the fraudulent commercial bridge. Loan a single call to the bank's fraud division, backed by the undeniable evidence of forged digital signatures, stopped the $500,000 transaction cold. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk and watched as decades of misguided parental support were methodically dismantled. Next went the joint accounts. Over the years, I had maintained 2 high-yield checking accounts with Brennan and Nadel, listed as authorized users, a safety net they had treated as a personal endless ATM. A few keystrokes and an emergency authorization mandate froze those accounts solid. No withdrawals, no transfers, no credit line advances. The faucet was shut off. But the real blow, the one that would strip the camouflage from their lavish lives, was the cancellation of the automatic transfers. Every month, $12,000 had flowed silently out of my private estate trust and into their accounts. It was the hidden engine powering their illusions of success. I told Clifford to cancel them permanently. But I did not stop there. I knew the exact rhythm of my children and their financial obligations. Today was Wednesday. In exactly 48 hours, the illusion would shatter. I had spent the last 10 years bailing them out of their own careless timing. I knew the schedule by heart. Friday was when the automatic drafts hit. Brennan liked to call himself a serial entrepreneur, a title that carried real weight at upscale cocktail parties. The reality was considerably less impressive. His current venture, a tech consulting firm that generated nothing but bloated expense reports, ran a payroll cycle that cleared every other Friday morning. I remembered when he launched the company 3 years ago, arriving with a polished presentation and an outstretched hand. I wrote the check because a father wants to believe in his son. But for the last 6 months, my secret transfers were the only reason his small team ever saw a paycheck. He had leveraged his entire lifestyle against my quiet generosity, counting on an invisible safety net that he assumed would always catch him. On Friday morning, when he tried to push payroll through his commercial account, he would hit a brick wall. No grace period, no warning from me, just a cold, hard, insufficient funds notification. He would be forced to face his employees and explain why their checks had bounced. Nadelle's reckoning would arrive the same day, though. Hers was bound to something she prized far more than business social standing. Nadelle and Holden held memberships at the most exclusive country club in the county, a place where image was currency, where they rubbed shoulders with old money families and worked hard to pass as one of them. Their monthly membership dues, together with the lease payments on the 2 luxury vehicles sitting in their driveway, were set to draw directly from the joint account I had just frozen. When the payment declined, it would not be a quiet, private matter. The club was notorious for swiftly and publicly suspending the accounts of members who fell behind. Nadelle would try to pay for a mimosa at the clubhouse on Friday afternoon, and her card would be declined in front of the exact people she was most desperate to impress. The humiliation would be instantaneous and total. I left Clifford's office with a stack of confirmation receipts and drove back to Western Virginia Hill Country. The 2-hour drive was the quietest journey of my life. For 38 years, I had trained myself to react to my children, to their crises, to their needs. If Brennan needed capital, I opened my checkbook. If Nadelle was in a bind, I smoothed it over. I had built a 15-acre estate with my bare hands, and still, I had let my own children treat me like a disposable resource. As I turned up the long, winding driveway, the full weight of what I had set in motion finally settled over me. I parked and simply sat there, staring at the sprawling mid-century modern home. Lorinda and I had designed every sharp angle and sweeping window. We had built it to be a gathering place, a sanctuary for a family that in the end had only ever existed in our hopes. I walked into the empty house and the silence pressed in from every side. But this time it didn't feel lonely. It felt clean, like a sterile operating room scrubbed and ready. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, leaning against the counter where Lorinda used to stand. I could almost hear her voice drifting through the quiet. "Gerald," she used to say, her eyes carrying that gentle but unsparing wisdom she never lost. "If you keep putting pillows under them every time they stumble, they will never learn to brace for a fall. You are not protecting them. You are just delaying the crash." She had been right all along. My years of financial support had not built independence. They had cultivated an unshakable sense of entitlement. Entitlement to my money, to my property, and ultimately to my life. The 48-hour trap was set. Wednesday night rolled into Thursday morning. The hours passed with an agonizing wait. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't reach for music. I spent the day walking the outer edges of the property, running my hands along the great oak trees, pressing my boots into the solid, unforgiving earth. I was grounding myself, bracing my mind for the emotional violence that was about to erupt. I checked my phone from time to time, not to reach out but to confirm the silence held, and it did. My children never called to ask how the birthday evening ended. They never called to check on me. They were fully absorbed in their own self-important worlds, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had just been cut away. Thursday night arrived heavy with anticipation. I made myself a simple dinner and sat at the very same dining room table where I had endured their cold birthday dismissal. My phone rested silently on the polished wood. They believed they had put me in my place, asserted their dominance by telling an old man to stay out of the way. They had no idea that their arrogant dismissal was the precise catalyst needed to sever them from my accounts forever. I went to bed that night and slept more soundly than I had since Lorinda passed. The deep, dreamless sleep of a man who has finally set down a weight he should never have carried. When the sun crested the hills on Friday morning and lit up the green expanse of the estate, I was already awake before the alarm. I brewed strong black coffee and carried it out in a heavy stoneware mug to the back porch. The air was crisp, carrying a faint earthy scent of rain, not far off. I settled into my favorite cedar rocking chair and rested the phone on the small table beside me. The trap was armed, the financial systems were fully automated and entirely unforgiving. At 9 in the morning, the banks would process the drafts. At 9 in the morning, the checks would bounce, the accounts would lock, and the full unvarnished reality of their so-called independence would come crashing down. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth steady me. I did not feel vengeful. I did not feel cruel. I felt like a master architect, watching a poorly constructed building finally give way to its own structural flaws. All I had to do was wait in the quiet because I knew the screaming was coming. The financial trap was in place, but a digital wall wouldn't be enough to hold back the storm. I knew my children. When the accounts locked and the cards declined, their first instinct wouldn't be reflection. It would be raw, unadulterated fury. They would come to the estate demanding answers and demanding entry. I needed a physical barrier to match the financial one already in place. I didn't consult a local directory for an ordinary contractor. I called a private firm in Richmond that specialized in rapid deployment security for high-net-worth clients. I told the operations director I needed an impenetrable perimeter, secured at the main entrance of my 15-acre property, fully operational within 24 hours. He told me the timeline was highly unusual and would carry an exorbitant premium. I told him cost was not a concern and wired a $40,000 retainer before we even hung up the phone. By noon on Thursday, my quiet driveway had become a highly coordinated construction zone. 3 heavy-duty utility trucks rolled up the long gravel path, followed by a flatbed hauling massive sections of solid wrought iron. A crew of 10 men dressed in unmarked charcoal uniforms climbed out and moved immediately with the precision of a tactical unit. They asked no unnecessary questions. The foreman, a stoic man with a serious bearing, walked the main entrance perimeter, with me assessing the natural choke points formed by the dense tree line and the roll of the hills. We settled on the optimal placement for the primary barrier. Within the hour, excavators were breaking ground to pour rapid-curing industrial concrete for the gate pillars. The deep rumble of heavy machinery rolled across the valley, shattering the estate's usual stillness. I stood on the porch with my coffee and watched thick iron bars being lifted into the air. It felt entirely surreal. I had designed this property to be open, welcoming, woven into the landscape around it. Now I was turning my home into a fortress. As the welding torches threw bright arcs of light and fused the heavy iron joints together, my thoughts drifted back to Lorinda, my beautiful, clear-eyed Lorinda. She had always possessed a sharpness of vision I lacked when it came to our children. I was the architect, always wanting to build things up, always wanting to smooth the rough edges from my children's lives. Lorinda was the realist. She understood that a foundation has to cure under pressure to hold. I can still recall a rainy evening more than a decade ago. We were sitting in that same living room when Brennan had come to me asking for a substantial loan to cover his second failed business venture. I had agreed on the spot writing the check, without so much as glancing at his accounting records. Lorinda waited until he was gone before she turned to me with a look of deep disappointment. "Gerald," she said, her voice soft, but carrying something firm underneath it. "You think you are being a good father by catching them every time they fall, but you are not. You are stealing their resilience. You are teaching them that failure has no cost because you will always step in to absorb the damage." I argued with her that night. I told her my success was hollow if I couldn't use it to make our children's lives easier. I said Brennan just needed a little more time to find his footing, and that Nadell just needed some help keeping up her social standing to build her real estate client base. Lorinda had slowly shaken her head and looked at me with a sad, knowing expression. "Over-coddling them is going to ruin them, Gerald. If you never let them feel the pain of a scraped knee one day, they'll jump off a cliff expecting you to provide a parachute." She warned me that my endless generosity was cultivating a dangerous sense of entitlement. She told me that one day they would stop asking for my help and start demanding it, that they would stop seeing me as a father and start seeing me as an inexhaustible resource. I refused to hear it. I believed my love could outrun their irresponsibility. But standing there watching the security crew hoist the heavy iron gates into place, I finally swallowed the bitter truth. Lorinda was right. She had always been right, and my stubborn refusal to listen had produced the very people I was now building a wall to keep out. My financial enabling had crippled my own children, stunted their growth, and shaped them into greedy, dependent adults. The afternoon gave way to evening, and the construction crew worked without pause beneath towering halogen work lights. Once the primary iron gates were anchored to the reinforced concrete pillars, the technology team moved in. This was not some basic keypad setup. I had specified the highest tier of access control available. The technicians mounted high-definition night vision-capable surveillance cameras at multiple angles, eliminating any blind spot near the entrance or along the perimeter fencing. Every camera fed directly into a secure server in my study, giving me live monitoring from a tablet anywhere in the house. Then came the access terminal. They installed a sleek weatherproof biometric scanner on a steel pedestal just outside the gate. It required a registered fingerprint to engage the hydraulic motors that drove the heavy iron doors open. I stepped into the cool evening air and pressed my thumb against the glowing glass reader. The machine chimed its quiet note of approval, and the massive gates swung open smooth and silent. I stepped back and watched them close again, the thick iron meeting with a resonant final thud. The physical barrier was complete. No one was coming up that driveway without my explicit biological consent. The security foreman handed me a master control tablet and a set of encrypted physical backup keys. He confirmed the perimeter sensors would alert my devices the moment anyone tried to scale the surrounding stone walls or tamper with the gate hardware. The firm also provided a direct line to their dispatch center with a private armed response team guaranteed to arrive within 10 minutes of a triggered alarm. I thanked the foreman and walked back up the long gravel driveway as the utility trucks loaded up and disappeared into the dark. The deep quiet of the night returned to the estate, but it felt nothing like before. The open, exposed property I had known was gone. In its place stood a fortress. I went inside, locked the heavy front door behind me, and walked to my study where I mounted the security tablet on the desk. The high-definition screens showed the iron gate standing tall and unyielding beneath the security lights. The driveway sat empty. The road beyond it was pitch black. I settled into my leather chair and looked at the framed photograph of Lorinda on my bookshelf. I whispered an apology into the quiet room, asking her forgiveness for taking this long to learn what she had tried so hard to teach me. I had finally stopped trying to be their parachute. I had finally built the wall they needed to hit. I turned off the desk lamp and went upstairs to sleep, knowing that when Friday's sun came up, the financial detonation would occur, and my children would find themselves locked out of the kingdom they believed was theirs by right. Friday's dawn arrived looking like any other morning, yet the air felt charged thick with a quiet electricity. I was awake just before 6. Faint light crept through the bedroom blinds, casting long, familiar shadows across the hardwood floor that Lorinda and I had laid together. I didn't rush. I took a long, hot shower, shaved with deliberate care, and dressed in comfortable slacks and a crisp collared shirt. Today was the day the illusions came us apart, and I wanted to be sharp and fully present for the fallout of a lifetime of enabling. I came down the sweeping staircase to the kitchen, the silent house feeling remarkably solid and vast around me. I measured out my favorite dark roast, listening to the comfortable rhythm of the coffee maker and breathing in the rich, bitter aroma as it brewed. As I poured the steaming liquid into my mug, the complete stillness of the morning was broken without warning. My phone resting on the granite countertop began to vibrate, then again, then again. The screen blazed with a rapid, frantic cascade of notifications, lighting up the dark kitchen tiles like an alarm. The dominoes I had carefully arranged were starting to fall. I picked up the phone and checked the lock screen. The first wave of panic came from Brennan. 7 text messages in 3 minutes, evolving quickly from puzzled confusion to breathless desperation. Dad, did you change your bank routing number? Dad, the transfer didn't go through. Call me back immediately. Dad, my payroll just bounced. My employees are threatening to walk out. Pick up the phone. I read each message slowly, letting the weight of his situation settle in. I could picture him precisely sitting in his overpriced glass-walled office in Richmond, sweating through his tailored suit as his carefully constructed reality collapsed underneath him. For years, he had played the part of the untouchable tech visionary, handing out paychecks funded entirely by my silent, misguided generosity. Without my money, he was nothing but an imposter, with a bloated overhead and an empty account. The invisible safety net had dissolved, and he was now in freefall toward the hard, unforgiving ground of consequence. Before the screen could dim, the phone erupted again. This time, it was Nadell. Her messages came in erratic, fragmented bursts that made the hysteria plain. "Dad, what is going on with the joint account? My card just declined at the country club. I am so humiliated." Holden is furious. "The leasing company just flagged our pearl gray luxury SUV for non-payment. They are threatening repossession. Answer your phone." I took a slow, deliberate sip of strong black coffee. The bitter taste fit the moment exactly. I could see her in my mind standing in the marble foyer of that elite country club, face burning with shame as the cashier handed back her declined platinum card in front of her wealthy circle. And I could imagine Holden beside her, her arrogant husband, who had always looked at me like a relic not worth acknowledging, suddenly grasping that the lavish lifestyle he boasted about rested entirely on the man he had openly despised. They were learning the hard way that an empire built on someone else's money can be repossessed in a matter of seconds. The frantic messages gave way to relentless calls. Brennan rang twice, Nadell 3 times, then Brennan again. The phone vibrated endlessly against the granite, a desperate mechanical pulse begging for a rescue. I did not answer. I didn't even press decline to push the calls to voicemail. I simply let it ring, letting them sit inside, the agonizing, stretching silence of a plea gone unanswered. Just days ago, they had told me to stop calling them. They had explicitly demanded that I stay on my own and figure it out because they were far too busy with their own important lives. I was merely honoring their harsh boundaries with absolute unrelenting compliance. I silenced the ringer, completely slipped the phone into my pocket, and picked up my coffee mug. I carried it out to the back porch and settled into my favorite cedar rocking chair. The morning dew still clung to the broad lawn, and the estate sat in remarkable peace beneath the bright morning sun. But my attention was not on the beautiful landscape Lorinda and I had shaped together. I pulled the security tablet from the side table and rested it on my lap. The high-definition screen showed the live feed from the massive iron gates at the foot of the long gravel driveway. Those thick metal bars stood resolute and uncompromising physical boundary between my hard-earned peace and the chaos bearing down on me. I took another slow sip of coffee and felt a deep, heavy sense of closure settle over my chest. For decades, I had contorted myself to manage their endless emergencies, compromising my own retirement and my own peace of mind, so they would never have to confront the ugly consequences of their choices. That era of foolish generosity was now finished. I watched the digital clock on the tablet tick forward minute by minute. Their initial panic would soon harden into blinding fury. They would never quietly accept a declined card or a bounced payroll. They would demand a physical confrontation. They expected to storm up here and browbeat a lonely, grieving old man into silent submission. They assumed they could simply arrive, demand my checkbook, and slide back into their parasitic arrangement as though nothing had changed. I kept my eyes on the surveillance feed, the empty winding road leading up to my gates. I felt no fear. I felt no regret. I simply felt ready. I drew a slow breath of the crisp morning air and kept watching the empty driveway on the screen. I knew they were coming. The sleek tires of a black luxury sedan shrieked around the sharp curves of the highway. Inside the immaculate leather interior, Brennan gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles went white. Sweat gathered on his forehead, wrecking his perfectly styled hair and soaking into the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. He pressed the accelerator harder, ignoring the speed limit entirely. Beside him, his wife Tamsin stared at her phone with an expression of pure, undiluted horror, furiously refreshing her banking app and praying for a result that refused to come. Brennan slammed his hand against the steering wheel with a shout of frustration. He told Tamsin his father was just an old man who didn't understand technology. He muttered that his father had probably tapped the wrong button on his tablet and accidentally flagged the account. Brennan insisted that had to be the explanation because nothing else made any sense. Tamsin didn't look up from her screen. Her Her voice came out sharp and threaded with a frightening hysteria as she told Brennan her elite spa membership had just been declined, that the receptionist had looked at her like she was some kind of criminal. She warned him that if his father had ruined their credit score because he forgot a simple password, she was going to completely lose her mind. Brennan swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot of dread tightening in his gut. The bounced payroll was a disaster he could barely hold in his head. His employees were demanding answers, and his vendors were threatening to cut off supply lines. He desperately needed that $12,000 transfer. He needed that joint account open and working. Without that invisible financial safety net, his entire identity as a successful tech visionary was nothing more than a fragile house of cards waiting to collapse. He pressed harder on the gas, convinced that a quick, forceful conversation with his father would put everything right. He planned to walk into the house, demand the banking credentials, and correct the old man's ridiculous technical error himself. A few miles behind, Nadell was pushing her pearl gray luxury SUV down the same road with equal desperation. Her husband Holden sat in the passenger seat, angrily adjusting his designer watch and muttering insults under his breath. Nadell kept glancing at the rearview mirror, checking her flushed face and fighting to steady her ragged breathing. The humiliation she had just suffered at the country club was burning a hole through her chest. Her wealthy friends had watched her premium card get declined. The club manager had loudly asked her to provide an alternative form of payment in front of the entire dining room. It was the worst moment of her life, and she blamed her father completely. Holden aggressively unbuttoned his jacket and glared out the window. He told Nadell that her father had officially lost his mind, that they should have taken control of his finances years ago. He called his father-in-law a senile old fool playing around on a computer he didn't understand. He insisted the old man had probably fallen for a phishing scam and locked the estate trust out of sheer incompetence. Nadell gripped the wheel and fought back her angry tears, nodding in furious agreement. She declared her father was completely incompetent. She complained that she had told him to stay on his own and figure it out, but clearly he couldn't even manage a basic bank transfer without destroying their lives. She promised Holden that when they arrived, she was taking her father's phone and his laptop away. She was getting the power of attorney paperwork started first thing Monday morning. She refused to let an old man torch their social standing because he was too out of touch to use the internet. They were all fully blinded by their own colossal arrogance. It never once occurred to Nadell or Brennan that this financial blockade was deliberate. They had spent their entire adult lives treating their father as a bottomless supply of resources. They genuinely believed he was a lonely, grieving widower who would do absolutely anything to hold on to their affection. The idea that he possessed the resolve to cut them off on purpose was a concept their entitled minds simply could not entertain. They were driving toward the estate with the furious, righteous indignation of spoiled children, abruptly denied their favorite toys. The black luxury sedan and the pearl gray luxury SUV finally converged at the base of the mountain road, leading up to the estate. Brennan spotted his sister in the rearview mirror and leaned on his horn, broadcasting his shared frustration. Nadell flashed her headlights in answer and pressed her foot down to match his pace. Together, the two vehicles roared up the familiar rural highway, tearing through the quiet afternoon like a mechanical storm. Inside his car, Brennan was rehearsing the speech he intended to deliver. He was going to march through the heavy front doors, find his father in the study, and loudly demand the immediate restoration of his funds. He was going to use his loudest, most authoritative corporate voice to bully the old man into submission. He pictured his father, apologizing profusely, looking small and bewildered behind the big desk. Brennan felt a surge of aggressive confidence. He was the successful entrepreneur. He was the man in charge. His father was just a retired relic who needed to be handled and managed. In the other vehicle, Nadell was rehearsing her own dramatic entrance. She planned to cry just enough to make her father feel crushing guilt for the embarrassment she had endured at the country club. She would tell him that his foolish technological blunder had caused her serious emotional distress. She knew precisely how to play the victim and work his paternal instincts. Holden sat beside her, cracking his knuckles, fully prepared to intimidate the old man and seize control of the banking portals. The green trees blurred past their windows as they closed in on the final stretch of road. The estate sat just over the next sweeping hill. They were consumed by their anger, entirely unaware of the reality waiting for them. They believed they were pulling up to an open, unguarded house occupied by a weak old man who would fold the instant they raised their voices. They had no idea they were speeding blindly toward a heavily fortified castle. They had no idea that the man waiting for them was not a confused victim of a banking error, but a master architect who had carefully engineered their absolute ruin. The expensive tires chewed up the asphalt as both cars crested the final hill, utterly unprepared for the massive, immovable iron reality about to stop them cold. The black sedan tore off the main highway in a spray of dust and loose gravel as Brennan took the familiar sharp turn onto the private road leading up to the estate. He was moving at a reckless clip propelled by that volatile cocktail of adrenaline and raw financial terror. He fully expected the long, curving driveway to unfold ahead of him, clear and unobstructed, leading straight to his father's front doors. But as the black luxury sedan crested the last gentle rise, Brennan was forced to jam both feet onto the brake pedal with desperate full-body force. The heavy car shrieked and slid across the pavement. The anti-lock braking system shuddered and chattered as the tires howled against the asphalt. The sharp bite of burned rubber flooded the immaculate leather interior instantly. Tamsin pitched violently forward against her seatbelt, releasing a breathless, high-pitched cry of pure terror. Just inches from their expensive front bumper rose a massive, unyielding wall of solid black iron. Brennan sat rigid behind the wheel, gripping it so hard his knuckles trembled as the dust drifted slowly over the hood. His mind flatly refused to make sense of the towering structure filling his windshield. Where a simple open stone entryway had once stood flanked by neatly trimmed hedges, there was now a heavily fortified security gate. Thick, impenetrable iron bars climbed high into the blue morning air, anchored by freshly poured concrete pillars that looked more suited to a maximum security federal facility than to a retired architect's quiet Western Virginia hill country home. Sleek, high-definition surveillance cameras were mounted at the very top of the structure, their dark lenses angled directly down at the sedan's windshield. A glowing biometric access terminal stood on a heavy steel pedestal just beyond reach. This was no construction detour, no mistake. It was a deliberate, expensive, and absolute blockade. The initial shock held for only a few seconds before blinding, entitled rage swept in to replace it. Brennan slammed his open palm down onto the center of the steering wheel. The horn erupted a long, aggressive, echoing blast that shattered the serene morning quiet of the valley. He kept his hand pressed down, letting it scream for 10 solid seconds, fully expecting his father to come scrambling out of the house in a panic. He expected the heavy gates to swing open in the fearful obedience, but the irons simply stood there utterly indifferent to his corporate fury. Tamsin covered her ears and screamed at him to stop, her voice climbing into a hysterical register as the reality of their locked accounts and this locked gate began crashing together violently in her mind. Right behind them, the pearl gray luxury SUV skidded to an equally chaotic stop, nearly rear-ending the black sedan. Nadell threw her hands up in pure disbelief, mouth hanging open as she stared through her windshield at the imposing fortress her childhood home had become. She frantically unbuckled her seatbelt, but her husband Holden was already moving. He shoved the passenger door open so hard it bounced back on its hinges. Holden stormed past the idling black car, his face flushed a deep, furious crimson. He was a man entirely accustomed to getting his way, a mid-level manager who made a living pushing his subordinates around. He marched straight to the iron gate, grabbed the thick black bars with both hands, and shook them with everything he had. The heavy metal didn't so much as rattle. It was anchored deep into the earth. Holden stepped back, chest heaving, and spotted the access terminal on the steel pedestal. He crossed to it and began furiously stabbing his fingers at the polished glass screen, hunting blindly for a call button or a keypad. He found a small silver intercom button and mashed it down, leaning his face so close to the speaker that his breath fogged the metal. He roared into the microphone, demanding that Gerald open the gate this very second. He screamed that they knew he was in there, playing his petty games with the bank accounts. Holden threatened that if the gate wasn't opened immediately, he'd call the police and have the old man dragged out for elder endangerment. Brennan finally threw open his driver's side door and stormed up beside his brother-in-law. He was practically vibrating, pointing a shaking finger directly into the lens of the primary surveillance camera above. He shouted at the camera that this wasn't funny anymore. He screamed that his payroll had just bounced and demanded to know whether his father had any idea what he'd just done to his company. Brennan demanded the gate be unlocked and the new routing numbers handed over right this second. He yelled that his father needed to stop throwing a childish tantrum just because they missed one stupid birthday dinner. They stood there shoulder to shoulder, two grown men pitching an absolute fit on the outside of a fortified wall, waiting for the frail old man they had so casually written off to answer their demands. But the voice that finally cut through the silence did not belong to their father. It didn't come from the intercom speaker at all. It came from the dense tree line, just to the right of the concrete pillars. A heavy reinforced door built seamlessly into the natural landscaping swung open, revealing a discreet climate-controlled guard house that had been entirely invisible from the road. A man stepped out into the morning sun. He was not a neighborhood watch volunteer or a friendly community patrolman. He was a highly trained operative from an elite private security firm, tall, broadly built, dressed in a spotless tactical black uniform bearing absolutely no identifying logos. A secure earpiece sat discreetly in his left ear, and a heavy utility belt wrapped his waist. His posture was perfectly straight, his expression entirely unreadable. He looked like a man who was paid a very premium salary to remain completely unbothered by wealthy people having meltdowns. In his right hand, he carried a simple black aluminum clipboard. He walked slowly and deliberately toward the iron gate, stopping just a few feet from where Brennan and Holden were standing. He did not look intimidated. He did not look angry. He simply regarded them with the cold, assessing gaze of a professional sizing up a minor perimeter disturbance. Holden immediately redirected his fury at this new target. He jabbed a finger through the iron bars, barking at the guard that he didn't know who he was or what kind of scheme he was running on his father-in-law. He commanded the guard to open the gate, immediately insisting they were family with legal rights to be on the property. He threatened to have the guard arrested for trespassing and unlawful imprisonment if the gate stayed shut. The guard did not flinch. He did not reach for his radio. He calmly glanced down at the clipboard, flipping a single page with a slow, unhurried motion. He scanned the information for a moment before looking back up, meeting Holden's furious red-faced glare with absolute chilling composure. His voice, when it finally came, was deep, steady, and completely stripped of any customer service warmth. It was the voice of an immovable object. He informed them in a remarkably level tone that he needed all of them to step back from the access terminal. He stated plainly that this was a private, restricted estate and that they were blocking the primary access road. Brennan grabbed the iron bars, his knuckles going stark white. His voice shifted rapidly from fury to desperate, high-pitched panic. He tried to explain that his father was inside, that his name was Gerald. Brennan frantically identified himself as the son, pointed to Nadell, and said she was the daughter. He begged the guard to just radio the house and tell Gerald his children were outside. He babbled that his father had made a simple mistake with the bank, and would surely tell the security team to let them in if they only called up to the house. The guard slowly lowered the clipboard. He looked directly into Brennan's desperate, sweating face, completely unmoved by the frantic explanation. He did not reach for his radio to verify the story. He did not ask for identification. He simply stood perfectly still on the other side of the iron barrier because he already knew exactly who they were. The guard held his black aluminum clipboard at his side. He did not blink. He did not offer a single ounce of empathy or understanding. He simply stared at Brennan with eyes that had faced far worse threats than a panicking man in a wrinkled designer suit. Brennan's chest heaved as he waited for the guard to reach for the radio and call up to the main house. He expected the man to apologize for the confusion and punch the code into the biometric scanner, but the guard did nothing of the sort. He simply planted his boots on the asphalt and looked at the two furious men standing on the wrong side of the iron bars. A fresh, much hotter surge of panic climbed Brennan's throat. He seized the thick metal bars with both hands, rattling them with whatever strength remained in him. His voice cracked and broke as he screamed into the crisp morning air. "We are his children. Open the gate. We have every right to be here. My business is coming apart, and I need to speak to my father right this second. Open the gate." The guard made no move toward the gate controls. He did not reach for his radio. He lifted his chin slightly, projecting his voice, so it carried cleanly over the idling engines of both luxury vehicles. His tone was smooth and entirely stripped of any willingness to negotiate. "Mr. Gerald has explicitly revoked your access to this property. You are trespassing on a private estate. I need you to return to your vehicles and turn them around immediately." The words settled in the air, heavy and absolute. Holden stepped back, his mouth falling open as the weight of that statement landed on him. Tamsin let out a loud, hysterical sob from the passenger seat of the black sedan, burying her face in her hands. She understood exactly what those words meant. The endless flow of money had stopped. The bank accounts weren't frozen because of a technical glitch or a phishing scam. They were locked because the man they had treated like a personal ATM had finally decided to close the vault. Nadell couldn't absorb the rejection. The searing humiliation she'd endured at the country club was still raw in her mind. Her friends had whispered as her card was declined. The club manager had regarded her with courteous contempt. She had driven all the way up this mountain, fully intending to scream at her father for embarrassing her. The notion that she was now being turned away by a hired employee was entirely unacceptable. Nadell shoved open the door of the pearl gray luxury SUV and marched toward the iron gate, her high heels striking the pavement with sharp, furious clicks. Her face was twisted with a combination of white-hot rage and sheer disbelief. She pushed past her husband and her brother, throwing her full weight against the thick iron bars. She screamed that she was not leaving until her father walked down that driveway and faced her like a man. She wedged her arms through the gaps in the iron, straining toward the glowing biometric scanner on the steel pedestal. She thrashed wildly, clawing at empty air, her manicured nails scraping the cold metal casing. Nadell demanded that the guard stand aside, threatening to climb the fence herself if she had to. She yelled that she was the daughter of the man who owned this land, and no hired hand was going to keep her from what was rightfully hers. She had completely lost control, staging a full physical meltdown right there on the asphalt. The primary guard did not engage with her wild thrashing. He simply took one measured step backward, removed himself from her reach, and raised his left hand toward the hidden reinforced door in the tree line. It was a silent tactical signal. The heavy door swung open at once. Two more security guards emerged from the climate-controlled guardhouse, built just like the first, towering and broad-shouldered, dressed in identical unmarked black tactical uniforms. They moved with a frightening synchronized efficiency. They did not run, they did not shout. They marched forward and came to a stop directly behind the iron gate, positioning themselves shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall of solid muscle and unyielding authority. The sudden arrival of reinforcements completely broke what little nerve the children had left. Nadell stopped screaming, her arms dropping limply to her sides as she stared at the three imposing men. Brennan took a slow shaking step backward, his hands sliding off the bars. Holden grabbed his wife by the arm and pulled her away from the gate. The sheer physical force of their presence was overwhelming. This was not a lonely old man they could browbeat into giving in. This was a trained security detail that would not hesitate to act if they pushed any further. They were completely and utterly outmatched. High above the chaos, seated comfortably in his private study, Gerald watched the entire scene play out on his high-definition security tablet. He leaned back in his leather chair, a warm mug of strong black coffee in his hand. The live feed captured every detail with crystalline clarity. He could see the sweat running down Brennan's panicked face. He could see Nadell crying furiously into her hands as Holden dragged her from the gate. He could see the sheer undiluted terror in Tamsin's eyes as she stared out from the passenger seat of the sedan. For 38 years, Gerald had cleaned up every mess they ever made. He had written the checks. He had paid off the debts. He had swallowed their disrespect and their arrogance because he believed that was what a devoted father was meant to do. He had let them trample him under a misguided sense of obligation. But watching the security feed now, he understood that he was finally completely free. He felt no guilt whatsoever. He felt no shred of pity. What he felt was an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. The crushing weight he had carried for decades had at last been lifted from him. Gerald set his coffee mug carefully down on the wooden coaster on his desk. He leaned forward and pressed his finger to the silver intercom button on the security console. The audio link opened a direct connection to the powerful speakers mounted on the concrete pillars outside the gate. He drew a slow, deep breath, gathering every measure of strength and closure he had. His voice when he spoke was not angry. It was not vindictive. It was calm, steady, and filled with absolute finality. "You told me to stay on my own," Gerald said, his voice ringing out clearly through the outdoor speakers. The sound rolled across the driveway and drifted down the quiet rural valley. Down at the gate, all four of them froze instantly. Brennan snapped his head up, staring wildly at the surveillance cameras. Nadell stopped crying, her eyes wide with shock. Holden and Tamsin sat completely still in their vehicles. I took your advice. Gerald continued, his voice smooth and unhurried, filling every corner of that space. Goodbye. He released the intercom button and cut the connection for good. He did not wait to witness their reactions. He had no interest in their desperate apologies or their furious screaming. He simply settled back in his chair and watched the silent video feed, knowing the transaction was officially complete. Down at the base of the driveway, the three guards received their final orders through their earpieces. The primary guard stepped forward and leveled a firm, authoritative finger at Brennan and Holden. He told them to return to their vehicles immediately. He stated that the property owner had issued a final directive, and that any further resistance would bring an immediate police response and formal trespassing charges. He ordered them to put their cars in reverse and back slowly down the road. Brennan stared up at the surveillance cameras for one long, agonizing moment. His chest rose and fell as the crushing reality settled in. There would be no negotiation. There would be no bailout. The company he had built on his father's money would be gone by the end of the day. He turned away, shoulders folding in total defeat, and walked slowly back to the black sedan. He dropped into the driver's seat, deaf to Tamsin's frantic sobbing beside him. He gripped the steering wheel and shifted into reverse. Holden hauled Nadell back to the pearl gray luxury SUV. She was still weeping, her hands shaking as she climbed into the passenger seat. Holden slammed the door and jogged around to the driver's side. He did not look back at the guards. He put the vehicle in reverse and kept his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The three guards did not simply stand and watch them go. They moved forward in perfect unison, stepping out from behind the heavy iron gate. They flanked the two vehicles and used hand signals to direct the slow, humiliating retreat. Brennan and Holden were forced to ease their expensive cars backward down the long, winding driveway, the guards walking alongside them, making certain they didn't stop or try to turn around on the private property. It was a slow, grinding march of total defeat. The gravel crunched beneath the tires with every inch, each sound, an echo of their massive, spectacular failure. The guards escorted both vehicles all the way to the base of the mountain road, physically shepherding them off the estate and out onto the public highway. What you were about to hear changes everything, and the weight of it, once it lands, is something I don't think anyone could have prepared for. Before we get there, I want to ask you something honest. If someone you had loved and trusted your entire life had quietly been working against you, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you gather every piece of proof first and let the truth do the work on its own terms? The moment the tires crossed the property line, the guards stopped. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the asphalt, watching as Brennan and Holden finally shifted their cars into drive. The black sedan and the pearl gray luxury SUVs eased away, folding into the thin morning traffic. They looked small and utterly unremarkable as they vanished around the bend, rolling back toward a life they could no longer afford to maintain. The guards turned and marched back up the hill, disappearing behind the solid black iron bars. The heavy gate held its ground, standing watch over the quiet, beautiful estate. Inside the main house, Gerald lifted his coffee mug and took a long, satisfied sip. The coffee tasted exactly right. The house was perfectly still, and for the first time in his life, that stillness felt absolutely magnificent. The black sedan and the pearl gray luxury SUV pulled into the cracked, empty asphalt lot of a deserted strip mall just 3 miles down the highway. The engines idled, loudly ticking as heat radiated off the hoods. For a long, agonizing stretch, nobody climbed out. The deep humiliation of being walked backward down a private driveway by hired muscle hung thick in the stifling air inside both vehicles. Brennan held the leather steering wheel in a white-knuckled grip, his chest rising and falling as the catastrophic reality of his situation settled into his bones. His company was finished. The payroll had bounced. His phone was buried under furious messages from employees and vendors demanding money he simply didn't have. He shoved the car into park and kicked the door open. Out in the warm morning air, he began pacing frantically back and forth across the faded parking lines, dragging his hands through his carefully styled hair until it jutted out in wild, disheveled spikes. A moment later, the doors of the pearl gray SUV swung shut. Nadell stumbled out, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, doing nothing to conceal her streaked mascara and the swollen red skin beneath her eyes. Holden followed, his face locked in a mask of dark, seething fury. He was already barking into his cell phone, scrambling to negotiate an extension with the leasing company that was actively hunting down their vehicles. He ended the call and swore loudly, sending a loose piece of gravel skittering across the lot. Tamsin stepped out from the passenger side of the black sedan, but she was not crying. Tamsin was a woman who prized her social position above everything else. The knowledge that her credit cards were blocked and her elite spa memberships were being declined did not bring her to tears. It produced something colder and far more dangerous, a venomous, unforgiving rage. She shut the car door with enough force to rock the vehicle and walked straight toward her husband. She did not offer comfort. She leveled a sharp, manicured finger at his chest, her voice soaked in contempt. She demanded to know how Brennan had allowed a frail, retired old man to dismantle their entire lives in a single morning. She made clear she had no intention of going back to her social circle and admitting they were bankrupt because his father had thrown a tantrum. Brennan stared at his wife, eyes wide and desperate. He threw his hands up, asking what exactly she expected him to accomplish against a wall of solid iron and a squad of private tactical security. He told her his father had cut them off completely, the money was simply gone, and there was nothing in the world they could do to change that. Tamsin went very still for a moment, her eyes narrowing as her mind worked through the problem with cold efficiency. The fury in her face shifted into something far more calculated, pure icy precision. She dropped her hand and looked back toward the highway that led to the estate. Her voice fell to a calm, terrifying near whisper. She told Brennan they had been looking at this the wrong way entirely. She said that normal, loving, mentally sound fathers do not wake up one morning, freeze their children's accounts, and post armed guards at their own front gates. She turned slowly to face the group, something sharp and dark glinting in her eyes. She declared that Gerald had completely lost his mind. Holden stopped pacing and looked over at Tamsin, the flush draining from his face as her words landed. A slow, calculating smile pulled at his mouth. He moved closer to the group, his corporate instincts kicking in. He agreed with Tamsin completely. He pointed out that Gerald had been grieving alone in that vast empty house for 5 years since Lorinda passed. Holden suggested the grief and the isolation had finally broken the old man's fragile mind. He stated with confidence that the sudden installation of biometric scanners and iron security gates was not the behavior of a rational parent. It was a textbook picture of severe, unchecked paranoia. Nadell wrapped her arms around herself, glancing nervously between her husband and her sister-in-law. She asked what they were supposed to do about it, wiping tears as she said he'd thrown them out onto the street. Tamsin moved toward Nadell, placing a carefully composed, entirely hollow hand on her shoulder. She told Nadell that they were not about to let their beloved father spiral through a mental breakdown alone. She said Gerald was clearly a danger to himself and his finances, and that someone was obviously pulling his strings. Tamsin's eyes went wide as the perfect scapegoat presented itself. She announced loudly and with certainty that it was Clifford. She claimed the slick, high-priced attorney had poisoned the mind of a sick, senile old man, manipulating Gerald into locking his own family out so Clifford could quietly drain the estate trust for himself. The twisted, thoroughly invented narrative took hold immediately. It was precisely what all 4 of them needed to believe. It dissolved their guilt, excused every financial recklessness they had committed, and recast them as devoted, concerned children, fighting to rescue their ailing father from a predatory legal scheme. Brennan stood taller, his chest filling as he seized the fiction with desperate, grateful relief. He declared Tamsin an absolute genius. He said they were going to take control of the entire estate and cut Clifford out of the picture completely. Holden pulled his phone out again, but this time it wasn't a creditor he was dialing. He told the group he knew an aggressive litigation attorney in Richmond who specialized in hostile family takeovers and estate law. Holden dialed right there in the empty lot, pacing as he quickly and smoothly fed their entirely fabricated story to the lawyer on the other end of the line. He told the attorney that his father-in-law was suffering from advanced undiagnosed dementia, displaying erratic and highly paranoid behavior, and was currently being financially isolated and manipulated by his longtime attorney. The plan lurched into motion with terrifying speed. By mid-afternoon, all 4 of them were seated in a polished downtown Richmond law office, signing their names across a stack of legal declarations. They swore under penalty of perjury that Gerald was a danger to himself. They painted a heartbreaking, entirely fictional portrait of an old man losing his grip on reality-building walls to shut out the family that loved him most. They filed an aggressive emergency petition for full legal conservatorship. They demanded the court hand them immediate unilateral control over the entire estate, every banking portal, and the authority to remove Clifford from all legal duties on the spot. They walked out of the downtown Richmond courthouse that afternoon, feeling powerful, entirely convinced they had just outmaneuvered the master architect. They had set the hook with no idea they were swimming straight into the final devastating trap. The late afternoon sun slipped below the tree line, drawing long bands of amber light across the hardwood floors of the study. Gerald sat at his vintage drafting table, a piece of furniture he hadn't touched seriously since retirement, rolling a smooth graphite pencil between his fingers, staring at a blank sheet of drafting paper. This table was where he had solved problems for decades. When a load-bearing wall was failing, he calculated the reinforcement it required. When a foundation began to settle, he engineered a way to stabilize the ground beneath it. He was a man who had spent his life repairing structural failures. But gazing at the empty white paper now, he understood that some structures are simply beyond saving. Some things have to be torn all the way down so the ground can be cleared for something new. The deep quiet of the fortified estate was broken by the sharp, sudden ring of the phone on his desk. Gerald did not startle. He did not rush. He set the graphite pencil down, carefully aligning it parallel to the edge of the drafting board. He crossed to the heavy oak desk and picked up the phone. A single name filled the caller identification display. Clifford. Gerald swiped the screen and raised the phone to his ear. He did not say hello. He simply waited, knowing exactly why the attorney was calling at this hour. They took the bait. "Gerald," Clifford said, his voice coming through the receiver with crisp, unmistakable clarity. The lawyer sounded entirely professional, but beneath that polished surface there was a distinct note of grim satisfaction. They just filed an emergency petition for full legal conservatorship at the downtown Richmond courthouse. The ink on the paperwork is barely dry. Gerald stood gazing out the floor-to-ceiling window at the impenetrable iron gate holding firm at the bottom of his driveway. A slow, grim smile moved across his weathered face, not a smile of joy or triumph. It was the solemn expression of a man who had accurately forecast a devastating storm and was now watching the first rain begin to fall. "Read it to me, Clifford," Gerald said, his voice steady and entirely unsurprised. "Tell me exactly what my children swore under penalty of perjury." He heard the rustle of thick paper on the other end of the line. Clifford cleared his throat, ready to recite the complete fabrication the children had formally placed before a judge. "They claim you are suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia, Gerald. They stated under oath that you have been exhibiting highly erratic and dangerously paranoid behavior over the past 48 hours. They specifically pointed to the sudden installation of the security gates and the freezing of your assets as evidence that you have lost your grip on reality entirely." Gerald let out a quiet, dry chuckle. A remarkably convenient story. In their entitled minds, being held financially accountable was apparently a clear symptom of degenerative brain disease. "It gets better." Clifford continued, his tone dripping with professional disdain. "They didn't stop at your mental capacity. They came after me. They formally accused me of elder abuse and financial manipulation. They told the court I am exploiting a grieving, lonely old man, corrupting your thinking against your loving family, so I can quietly drain the estate trust for my own gain. They are petitioning for my immediate removal as your legal counsel, and demanding unilateral control over every asset you own." Gerald turned from the window and walked back toward his desk. The raw audacity of those lies was breathtaking, yet it was precisely what he and Clifford had expected. They had cornered his children financially, and rather than sit with their own staggering failures, the kids had chosen the most aggressive, fraudulent path available to them. They were attempting to use the legal system as a weapon to pry the keys to the castle from his hands. "Are they requesting an emergency hearing?" Gerald asked, settling against the edge of the heavy oak desk. "Yes," Clifford replied without hesitation. "Because they claimed you pose a direct threat to your own financial well-being and cited my supposed manipulation, the judge granted an expedited hearing. We are scheduled to appear in court Monday morning. They are going to stand before a judge and try to strip away your basic human rights so they can keep paying for their luxury cars and failing businesses." Gerald looked down at his hands. They were a builder's hands, rough, calloused, and steady. He had used these hands to feed those children, clothe them, and raise the very roof they grew up under. Now, those same children were trying to bind those hands legally so they could empty his pockets. Whatever grief had been lingering these past few days burned away, completely replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. The last thin thread of parental guilt snapped, leaving only the ruthless precision of an architect ready to execute a controlled demolition. "Clifford," Gerald said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "We handed them the rope, and they chose to fashion a noose. I want you to prepare the final set of documents." "You mean the medical files?" Clifford asked, confirming the strategy. "I mean everything," Gerald said. "Have the chief of neurology send over the certified results of my cognitive exams from last month. Have the psychiatric evaluation clearly flagged, showing I am in the top percentile for mental acuity for my age group. I want those medical records bound and ready to place before the judge the instant they finish telling their pathetic lies." "Consider it done, Gerald. The medical defense will be completely bulletproof." Clifford paused, the weight of what came next settling heavily on the line. "But what about the other matter? Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with the commercial trust transfer? Once I file these deeds, there is no going back. The estate and the surrounding land will be legally untouchable." Gerald turned to the window, one final time, looking out across the vast rolling 50 acres of prime real estate he had quietly held for decades. He could see the open fields where he was about to build a legacy that actually meant something. "I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life." "Clifford Sass," Gerald said, his tone absolute and unwavering. "Draft the transfer deeds. Move the 15-acre estate and the 50 commercial acres directly into the new architectural trust. Liquidate my personal ownership completely. When my children walk into that courtroom on Monday expecting to seize an empire, I want you to be ready to show them that the empire no longer exists." "Understood, Gerald." A rare note of admiration crept into Clifford's usually gruff voice. "I will have the final documents ready for your signature by tomorrow afternoon. Enjoy your weekend. It is going to be a very interesting Monday." Gerald ended the call and set the phone back on the desk. He crossed to the drafting table and picked up his graphite pencil. He did not feel tired. He did not feel old. He felt a surge of deep, revitalizing energy course through him. He set the tip of the pencil against the blank page and drew the very first sharp, unyielding line of his brand-new foundation. Monday morning arrived beneath a gray, overcast sky hanging low over Richmond. But the gloomy weather did absolutely nothing to dim the bright, triumphant energy of the four people striding up the wide concrete steps of the downtown Richmond courthouse. Brennan, Nadell, Tamsin, and Holden moved together in a tight, arrogant formation. They did not look like a family weighed down by the tragic mental decline of a beloved patriarch. They looked precisely like an executive board arriving to celebrate a highly profitable corporate takeover. Every detail of their appearance had been carefully curated to project quiet, tasteful wealth and deep respectability. Brennan wore Brennan's bespoke charcoal suit that cost well over $3,000, a suit paid for entirely by the monthly allowance he had just lost. Tamsin walked beside him, draped in pristine, high-end fabrics, her designer handbag gripped firmly in her manicured hands. Nadell and Holden looked equally polished, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable arrogance. They were completely convinced they had already won. Inside the echoing marble hallway just outside the probate courtroom, they gathered in a tight circle to rehearse their performance one last time. Tamsin leaned in close, her voice dropping to a hushed conspiratorial whisper, reminding Brennan to soften his tone when addressing the judge. She told him to look heartbroken and reluctant rather than eager or angry. Nadell practiced her part with quiet precision, pulling a folded tissue from her purse and lightly touching the corners of her perfectly dry eyes. They were treating the systematic dismantling of their father's independence as nothing more than a minor theatrical production. They traded rapid, excited whispers about what came next, exactly what they would do the moment the judge handed them legal control over the sprawling 15-acre estate. Brennan muttered that he'd have the banking portals unlocked by noon, pushing his bounced payroll through before his employees walked out. Nadell whispered that she would personally oversee the sale of the property, while Holden assured them confidently that Clifford would be legally barred from the premises before lunch. The bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors and called the courtroom to order. All four of them walked down the center aisle and took their seats at the petitioner's table, moving with a practiced, studied solemnity. The courtroom was vast and hushed, carrying the heavy scent of old wood and floor wax. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man with decades on the bench, sat high above them, working through the thick stack of emergency filings. Brennan leaned forward, elbows on the long table. His face arranged itself instantly into a mask of profound manufactured sorrow. He shook his head slowly, murmuring to his expensive litigation attorney, playing the devastated son, driven by tragic circumstance, to take drastic legal action against his own beloved father. Nadell joined the performance seamlessly. She let out a soft, audible sniffle, pressing the tissue to her nose. She wanted the judge to look down from the bench and see exactly how deeply this terrible situation was costing her. Holden sat stoically beside her, draping a heavy, steadying arm around her shoulders, projecting the flawless image of a supportive, deeply concerned son-in-law. They were entirely convinced that their fabricated paperwork and their emotional performance were absolutely bulletproof. They believed fully that the false narrative they had constructed, a frail, paranoid, dementia-riddled old man, was the only reality that would matter inside this room. Then the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a deep, resonant thud. The sudden sound sliced through the quiet murmur of the proceedings, pulling heads around. Brennan, Nadell, Tamsin, and Holden twisted in their seats, looking back over their shoulders. They fully expected to see a frail, disoriented old man being wheeled down the aisle or guided carefully by a court-appointed health advocate. They expected the broken, paranoid victim they had so vividly described in their fraudulent legal petition. Instead, Gerald walked through the doors. The air in the room seemed to shift at once, drawn toward the commanding presence of the man crossing the threshold. He was not shuffling. He was not confused. He moved with the upright, perfectly balanced bearing of a master architect who understood exactly how to own a room. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that sat perfectly across his broad shoulders, paired with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie knotted sharply at his collar. His silver hair was combed neatly back. His jaw was set and his eyes burned with an intensity that left no room for doubt. He looked sharper, stronger, and more overwhelmingly clear-headed than he had in over a decade. The fragile, dementia-riddled ghost they had described in their sworn legal filings simply did not exist. Gerald paused for a fraction of a second at the head of the center aisle, fixing his steady gaze directly on his son and daughter. He did not look angry or rattled. He looked at them the way a judge looks at a defendant after the verdict has already been reached. Walking in perfect lockstep right beside him was Clifford. The veteran attorney moved like a predator who had caught the scent. He wore a charcoal pinstripe suit and an expression of supreme predatory confidence. In his right hand, Clifford carried a massive leather briefcase. The bag looked nearly burdensome, its seams straining under the weight of meticulously prepared, devastating truth. That briefcase held no desperate pleas, no emotional family defenses. It contained the absolute, undeniable proof of multiple felonies. As Gerald and Clifford strode purposefully down the center aisle toward the defense table, the smug, practiced smiles on the children's faces faltered for one fleeting, terrifying moment. The polished veneer of their performance began to crack. Brennan felt a cold bead of sweat form at the base of his neck and slide slowly down his spine. Nadell lowered her tissue, her manufactured tears evaporating instantly as she stared in open-mouthed shock at the imposing, unyielding figure of her father. He did not look like a man who needed a conservator to manage his affairs. He looked precisely like a man who was about to execute a flawless, merciless demolition of theirs. The courtroom fell perfectly still as the judge called the first witness to the stand. Brennan rose from the petitioner's table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit that cost well over $3,000. He walked toward the witness box at a slow, deliberate pace, working to project the image of a deeply reluctant, heartbroken son. He placed his right hand on the book, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. He looked up at the judge with wide, sorrowful eyes, carefully concealing the desperate financial panic, screaming just beneath the surface of his tailored exterior. His expensive litigation attorney stood and guided Brennan through his rehearsed testimony with a gentle hand. Brennan spoke in a soft, measured voice. He told the judge that his father Gerald had been suffering from profound isolation since the tragic passing of his mother, Lorinda, 5 years ago. Brennan claimed that over the past 48 hours, this quiet grief had suddenly and violently erupted into severe paranoid delusions. He described driving up to his childhood home only to find it barricaded behind massive, newly installed iron gates. He painted a frightening picture of his father, hiring a private tactical security force to physically expel his own loving family from the property. Brennan leaned forward, gripping the edges of the witness stand to underscore his fabricated anguish. He testified that his father had completely lost his grip on reality. He stated that Gerald had erratically frozen all the family bank accounts without warning or any logical reason. He told the judge his father was clearly suffering from advanced cognitive decline, unable to comprehend basic technology or manage his own substantial estate, and shifted his gaze pointedly toward Clifford, painting the veteran lawyer as a malicious predator, actively exploiting a sick, confused old man for personal financial gain. Brennan finished his direct testimony by dropping his head, performing the expression of a man utterly shattered by his father's tragic mental decay. The courtroom held its silence for a long, heavy moment. Then Clifford slowly rose from the defense table. He did not rush. He did not look angry. He walked to the center of the room, carrying a single thin manila folder. He regarded Brennan with the cold, precise focus of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. Clifford opened his cross-examination in a quiet, almost conversational tone. He asked Brennan to clarify a specific point regarding the frozen bank accounts. He asked whether the locked accounts were Brennan's personal corporate accounts or whether they were in fact private trust accounts solely owned and funded by Gerald. Brennan shifted uncomfortably in the wooden chair. He cleared his throat, reaching for a steady facade. He answered that they were joint family accounts used for estate management. Clifford did not let the evasion pass. He opened the folder and read from a bank statement. He asked Brennan to confirm that exactly $12,000 had been transferred from Gerald to Brennan and his sister every single month for the past 3 years. Brennan swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat forming at his temple. He stammered that his father had simply been helping with general family expenses. Clifford took a step closer to the witness box. His voice rose slightly, the words carrying cleanly off the marble walls. He asked Brennan whether it was true that without his father's monthly generosity, Brennan's technology consulting firm had completely missed payroll that past Friday morning. Brennan instantly turned a deep, blotchy red. His litigation attorney shot to his feet with an objection on relevance, but the judge overruled it, leaning forward with sudden, sharp interest. Brennan was forced to answer. He muttered a barely audible confirmation. Clifford smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. He asked Brennan whether it was possible his father was not suffering from paranoid delusions at all. He suggested that perhaps Gerald had simply recognized his son was a 38-year-old man running a bankrupt company and decided to close the bank permanently. Brennan gripped the railing of the stand, his knuckles going white as his carefully constructed narrative began unraveling under oath. He tried to push back, but Clifford simply thanked him and dismissed him from the stand, leaving Brennan thoroughly humiliated before the judge. Nadell was called to the stand next. She practically floated to the witness box, her face a masterclass in theatrical grief. She clutched a fresh tissue in her trembling hands and settled into the seat with a dramatic, helpless exhale. The moment her attorney began asking questions, Nadell broke into soft, practiced tears. She cried that she just wanted her dad to be safe. She wove a vivid emotional tale about arriving at the estate to check on his failing health, only to be confronted and terrified by armed guards. She claimed her father was a prisoner inside his own home, confused and frightened by the modern world. She looked directly at the judge, her voice cracking at precisely the right moment. She begged the court to grant the conservatorship so she could rescue her father from his own deteriorating mind. She argued that freezing the accounts proved he no longer understood how to pay his own bills or manage the basic demands of daily life. She painted herself as the ultimate devoted daughter, willing to shoulder the enormous burden of managing the sprawling estate out of nothing but pure, unconditional love. Clifford approached the witness stand for his second cross-examination. He offered Nadell no gentle pleasantries. He asked immediately about her country club membership. Nadell blinked her manufactured tears, stopping cold, as pure confusion crossed her face. She asked what her social club had to do with her father's failing health. Clifford informed the court that Nadell carrying over $80,000 in high-interest credit card debt. He read aloud from a financial disclosure, proving that the pearl gray luxury SUV was currently 3 months behind on lease payments and had been flagged for repossession on the exact same morning she claimed she had driven up to check on her father. Nadell opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The elegant, composed image she had so carefully projected just moments before shattered completely. Clifford kept right on going. He asked Nadell whether she had driven out to the estate that Friday morning because she was genuinely frightened for her father's well-being, or because her platinum card had just been declined in front of her moneyed circle. He asked her whether she wanted the conservatorship to shield Gerald, or because she desperately needed the legal lever to liquidate his holdings before her own creditors came to collect. Nadell flushed crimson, her voice climbing into a high defensive screech. She shouted that Clifford was distorting the facts and playing games with the court. She shrieked that she was entitled to that money. She was the daughter, and her father owed them a certain quality of life. The sudden eruption tore through the hushed courtroom like a thunderclap. Every trace of the grief-stricken, worried child had vanished, and what surfaced in its place was raw, venomous entitlement. The judge gazed down at Nadell with an expression of open, undisguised contempt. The portrait of a frail, paranoid father had been taken apart piece by piece. Clifford had expertly unmasked the children, not as devoted caretakers, but as broke, desperate adults scheming to legally plunder the man who had bankrolled every comfort of their lives. Gerald sat quietly at the defense table, watching his children writhe beneath the crushing exposure of their own lies. The snare had been sprung flawlessly, and the final killing blow was still waiting inside Clifford's heavy leather briefcase. The room still hummed with the chaotic fallout of Nadell's shrill, panicked outburst. The judge brought his gavel down hard against the block, demanding complete silence. He fixed his glare on the petitioner table, where all four of them sat stone still. Their carefully polished performance lay in rubble. Clifford stood in the center of the room, utterly composed, absorbing the raw fear radiating off the children. He addressed the judge in a smooth, resonant voice, announcing that the defense was ready to present its central evidence. Clifford moved back to the heavy leather briefcase on the defense table. He snapped the brass latches open. The crisp metallic crack rang out across the quiet room. He reached inside and drew out a clean white folder. He approached the bench and presented the documents to the judge. Clifford explained that the court had been offered a harrowing work of fiction about a man in severe cognitive decline. To answer that fabrication directly, Clifford submitted comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluations completed just 48 hours prior by the chief of neurology at the state medical board. He moved slowly in front of the witness stand, projecting his voice so that every person seated in the gallery could follow every word. He laid out the medical findings with surgical exactness. The reports confirmed that Gerald was not only entirely free of any degenerative brain disease, but that he had scored in the 99th percentile for mental acuity, spatial reasoning, and cognitive processing for his age group. The presiding psychiatrist had formally noted that Gerald was remarkably lucid and sharp, and possessed an extraordinary capacity for complex problem-solving. He was not some fragile paranoid victim. He was a highly functional master architect, operating at the very peak of his mental powers. The judge spent several long minutes working through the certified medical documents. He adjusted his glasses, turning page after page, his expression darkening with every paragraph he read. The legal bar for a conservatorship demanded undeniable proof of mental incompetence. The medical file in his hands proved precisely the opposite. He looked down at Brennan and Nadell, his eyes narrowing with sharp judicial anger. He told their litigation attorney bluntly that the medical evidence stood in direct contradiction to their sworn emergency petition. Brennan sank lower in his chair, feeling the walls of the courtroom pressing in around him. Tamsin seized his forearm, her nails digging painfully into his expensive tailored sleeve. They had staked everything on the assumption that a judge would simply look at an old man and believe the worst. It had never crossed their minds that Gerald would proactively secure airtight medical records in his own defense. But the demolition of their false narrative was only the beginning. Clifford had merely cleared the brush away. Now he was about to detonate the foundation itself. He returned to the briefcase and produced a second folder, far thicker than the first. This one was bound in heavy red cardstock. He walked back to the center of the room, holding the red folder up so the children could see it plainly. He addressed the judge, his voice dropping to a low and deeply unsettling register. He stated that the court had just watched a desperate bid to strip a perfectly healthy man of his most fundamental rights. Clifford then posed the judge a simple, penetrating question. Why would four wealthy, accomplished young adults commit perjury to seize an estate they were already destined to inherit? Clifford did not wait for the opposing counsel to object. He supplied the answer himself. He declared that this conservatorship petition had nothing whatsoever to do with medical care, isolation, or a father pushing his children away. He stated with booming absolute clarity that the children had filed this emergency petition for a single reason. They were frantically trying to cover their tracks after committing massive felony wire fraud against their own father. The word fraud hung in the stale courtroom air like something solid. Nadell gasped audibly, her hand flying up over her mouth. Brennan went the color of ash. Holden physically shoved his chair back from the table, as though trying to put distance between himself and an explosion already in progress. Their high-priced litigation attorney looked utterly bewildered, leaning in frantically and whispering to Brennan, demanding to know what Clifford was referring to. Brennan could not form a single word in response. His throat had gone completely dry. His heart was slamming against his ribs so violently he was certain something would give way. Clifford had approached the bench and handed the thick red folder to the judge. He then turned to face the gallery and began methodically dismantling the entire chain of events. He explained that 3 days ago, on the evening of his 71st birthday, Gerald had logged into his secure private banking portal. Clifford told the court that Gerald did not find a confusing or overwhelming technological interface. He found a highly suspicious critical security alert tied to the deed on his 15-acre estate. Clifford walked the judge through the documents line by painstaking line. He revealed the commercial bridge loan application, a formal request to borrow $500,000 using the entire unencumbered estate as collateral. The funds were directed to be dispersed immediately into an offshore holding account, managed jointly by Brennan and Nadell. Clifford directed attention to the final page of the application, highlighting the digital signatures. He explained that the children had deliberately bypassed their father, and his primary email address rerouted the secure verification codes and forged his digital signature with chilling precision. The judge turned to the back of the file, his face going a deep mottled red. He was an officer of the law, and he had no patience for being used as a pawn in a criminal scheme. He studied the digital logs that Clifford had thoughtfully included. Clifford announced that the Cybersecurity Division had traced the Internet Protocol addresses attached to the fraudulent loan submission. The digital footprint did not lead back to the estate in Western Virginia Hill Country. It led directly to the primary server inside Brennan's corporate technology office in Richmond. The timestamps showed the application was submitted, while Gerald sat alone at his dining room table, waiting for his children to arrive for his birthday dinner. The revelation was utterly devastating. Clifford drew the entire chaotic narrative together into one tight, damning package. He looked squarely at the children and laid out their true motive for the court. He stated that Gerald had not frozen their access and erected a security gate because he was paranoid. Gerald had built the gate because he caught them trying to steal the very roof over his head. The children had not filed for conservatorship out of love for him. They filed the emergency petition because the bank fraud division had flagged the forged loan, and they needed unilateral legal authority over the estate to force the paperwork through before federal authorities could be brought in. They needed to have their father declared legally incompetent so they could seize the deed, execute the final authorizations themselves, and bury their federal crimes beneath the cover of estate management. They were attempting to use the gavel of this very court to complete a $500,000 theft. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Every last molecule of air seemed to have been pulled from the room. Brennan dropped his head into his hands, understanding with crystalline clarity that he would not be returning to his luxury apartment today. He was staring down the corridor toward federal prison. Nadell was quietly hyperventilating, her pristine socialite image ground to dust. Holden and Tamsin pushed their chairs away from the table, physically distancing themselves from the two siblings, each trying desperately to swim free of the sinking ship. The judge slowly closed the red folder. The flat slap of the cardboard cover hit the air like a gunshot. He looked down at the petitioner table with a gaze so saturated with judicial fury that it made the litigation attorney physically flinch. The elaborate illusion of the caring, prosperous children had been stripped completely away. They stood entirely exposed not as worried family members, but as ruthless, cornered criminals who had been caught with their hands buried in the till. Gerald remained at the defense table perfectly calm, perfectly silent, watching the final destruction of the entitled monsters he had unknowingly shaped. The foundation they had built their arrogant lives upon had just been reduced to rubble, and there was nothing left standing. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for an agonizing span of time, heavy, suffocating, pressing down on the shoulders of every person present. The judge sat high on his elevated bench, his eyes fixed on the thick red folder holding the incontrovertible proof of my children's absolute treachery. When he finally looked up, his face carried an expression of pure, unfiltered judicial disgust. He removed his reading glasses and folded them slowly, deliberately, setting them beside his gavel. He did not look at Brennan or Nadell first. He trained his furious gaze squarely on their highly paid litigation attorney. The judge leaned forward, his voice rolling through the vast marble chamber with the force of a thunderclap. He asked the attorney in a dangerously quiet tone whether it was his habit to use this court to facilitate $500,000 federal fraud schemes. The attorney shed whatever slick corporate composure he had managed to hold on to until that moment. He shot to his feet so quickly his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly across the polished floor. He threw his hands up, shaking his head and stammering that he'd had absolutely no prior knowledge of any forged loan documents. He began frantically sweeping his pristine legal pads and expensive pens into his briefcase, physically retreating from the petitioner table. He practically shouted that his clients had deceived him and formally requested to withdraw as their legal counsel on the spot. The judge granted the withdrawal with a sharp, dismissive wave. The attorney spun on his heel and nearly sprinted down the center aisle, leaving Brennan and Nadell completely abandoned to face whatever was coming. With the lawyer gone, the judge turned his full wrath on my children. He leaned over the polished mahogany bench, his voice heavy with profound contempt. He said that in his 30 years presiding over probate and estate law, he had watched families tear each other to pieces over money, but he had rarely encountered anything as fundamentally despicable as what he had witnessed today. He told Brennan and Nadell that they had not only attempted to steal their father's home and financial security, but had shamelessly tried to strip away his human dignity in the process. They had walked into his courtroom and weaponized the legal system, attempting to have a perfectly healthy, lucid man declared incompetent solely to bury a massive financial crime. Brennan sat completely paralyzed. He stared blankly at the judge, his mouth working open and shut without producing a single word. The polished, successful entrepreneur he had presented to the world had dissolved entirely, leaving only a terrified, bankrupt man staring down the barrel of a ruined life. Nadell was no longer shedding theatrical tears for sympathy. She was sobbing violently from a place of sheer, unvarnished terror. Her hands trembled as she grasped that her country club friends and her elite social circle would soon be reading about her attempted felony fraud. Holden and Tamsin sat rigid beside them, faces drained of every trace of color. They had entered the courthouse expecting a coronation, and were now coming to terms with the fact that they were bound to two people facing serious criminal exposure. The judge lifted his gavel and announced that he was dismissing the emergency conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice. He stated clearly for the official court record that I was entirely competent to manage my own affairs, and that the petitioners had acted with malicious, fraudulent intent. But the judge was not finished. He pointed the heavy handle of his gavel directly at Brennan. He warned my son that the Federal Bank Fraud Division took forged commercial bridge loans with deadly seriousness. The judge stated plainly that Brennan and Nadell were exceptionally lucky that Clifford had not yet forwarded the digital footprint and the forged documents to the federal prosecutor. He promised them that if they ever attempted to bring another petition before his courthouse, he would personally see to their criminal indictment. He brought the gavel down hard on the sounding block. The sharp, ringing crack marked the absolute and permanent end of their legal scheming. The courtroom held its stillness even after the official ruling. Nobody moved. The gallery simply stared at the four thoroughly humiliated figures slumped at the petitioner table. The magnitude of their defeat was total. They had nothing left. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their credit lines were exhausted. Their legal counsel had walked out on them. Their reputations lay in complete ruin. They had entered the room demanding an empire, and they were leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the terrifying shadow of a federal investigation hanging over them. I sat at the defense table, feeling a deep and steady peace. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the sobbing woman or the trembling man sitting across the aisle. Lorinda had been right all along. I had spent my whole life shielding them from the hard reality of consequences, and they had repaid that by trying to destroy me. Now they were finally feeling the full, crushing weight of the choices they had made. I had built the wall they needed to hit, and they had crashed into it at full speed. I pressed my palms flat against the mahogany table and rose slowly to my feet. I buttoned my tailored jacket with careful, deliberate precision. The movement drew every eye in the room. Brennan slowly lifted his head, looking up at me through terrified, bloodshot eyes. Nadell let out a soft, wretched whimper and shrank back into her heavy wooden chair. They looked at me the way cornered animals look at whatever is about to finish them. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to shout to make myself felt. I looked at my children and pitched my voice just enough to cut through their quiet sobbing. I told them that the judge had kept them out of a prison cell today, but that our business was not yet concluded. I looked at Holden and Tamsin in turn, making certain they understood they bore equal responsibility for this betrayal. I told all four of them to collect their things and get up. I told them to walk down the center aisle and step outside onto the courthouse steps. I had one final announcement, and they were going to stand there and hear every word of it. I turned away from their stricken faces and walked toward the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom. Clifford fell into step right beside me, his massive leather briefcase in hand. I did not look back to see whether they were following. I already knew they would. They had no other option. They were broken, emptied of all leverage, and desperately afraid I was going to hand them over to federal prosecutors. They were going to follow me out into that gray, overcast morning, and I was going to deliver the final decisive piece of my architectural masterpiece. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, sealing the suffocating tension of the courtroom on the other side. We moved out into the vast, echoing marble corridor. The cool air of the hallway met my face, but I felt remarkably warm and completely calm. I walked at an unhurried pace, listening to the frantic, scrambling footsteps clattering behind me. Brennan and Nadell were practically stumbling over each other to close the distance. Every trace of their polished, arrogant corporate bearing had been scoured away by the judge's ruling, leaving nothing behind but raw, naked desperation. Brennan caught my arm, his hands shaking badly. He begged me to stop, his voice fracturing in the high marble hallway. He swore he had never meant for things to spiral this far, and insisted the forged commercial loan had only ever been a temporary bridge. He tried to sell me on the idea that it was a panicked mistake made by a man trying to salvage his struggling tech company. He cried that he was staring down federal prison and total bankruptcy, begging his father to please call off the lawyers and undo the wreckage he had caused. Nadell pushed through beside him, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. This time, the tears were entirely real. She clutched my other arm, sobbing that her social world was in ruins, that her luxury cars were being repossessed as we stood there, and that she would do absolutely anything I asked if I simply restored her monthly allowance. She begged for a second chance and promised to become the devoted, caring daughter she had never actually been. I stood perfectly still and looked at the two children I had raised. I felt no sympathy, not a flicker of paternal warmth. Before I could even speak, the fragile alliance between the four of them cracked apart with sudden, violent force. Holden stepped forward, his face dark with furious, simmering resentment. He jabbed a trembling finger at Brennan and Nadell, loudly declaring to everyone within earshot in that hallway that he had absolutely nothing to do with the forged loan documents. He screamed that his wife and his brother-in-law were reckless, greedy fools who had dragged an innocent man headlong into a massive federal crime. Tamsin immediately threw herself into the screaming match. She turned on Brennan, demanding a divorce right there on the marble floor. She cried that she refused to remain legally tied to a bankrupt felon and watch her social standing evaporate over his staggering incompetence. They stood in a tight circle, savagely tearing each other to pieces like cornered animals fighting over the last scraps. I watched their toxic, unraveling display for a long moment, absorbing what it revealed about their true nature. The instant the free money disappeared, they turned on one another without hesitation. I did not raise my voice. I simply cleared my throat one sharp sound, and the vicious arguing stopped cold. They all swung around to look at me, eyes wide, with a last flickering thread of hope. They were still waiting for the master architect to step in and rebuild what they had wrecked. I looked at Brennan and told him his apologies were entirely hollow and meant nothing. I told Nadell that her tears were nothing more than the panic of a spoiled child watching her allowance get cut off. I explained calmly that they did not regret trying to steal my home and my security. They only regretted being caught. I told them I was not going to hand them over to federal prosecutors because watching them live inside the wreckage of their own terrible choices was a far more fitting and lasting punishment. Brennan let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. He actually attempted a smile, wiping the sweat from his forehead and thanking me in a rush of words. He had wrongly assumed that dodging a federal prison cell meant the frozen bank accounts would somehow unlock themselves. He took a step toward me and said we could head back to the estate, sit down over a proper dinner, and work out a sensible financial transition together. I shook my head, slowly dissolving that final illusion. I told Brennan we were not going anywhere together. I glanced at Clifford, who stood quietly at my side, observing the wreckage with calm eyes. I gave him a slight nod. Clifford unlatched his heavy leather briefcase one last time. He reached inside and drew out a single neatly bound legal document printed on the thick premium paper. He placed it directly in Brennan's hands. Nadell, Holden, and Tamsin immediately crowded around him, their eyes racing frantically across the dense legal text. I watched the very last shreds of their hope dissolve as they reached the first page. Brennan looked up at me, his face completely drained of color. His jaw trembled as he asked me what he was holding, his voice dropping to a terrified, barely audible whisper. I spoke with absolute clarity, making certain every word landed with full weight. I told them they had spent their entire lives assuming they were the sole heirs to my 15-acre estate. I revealed that what they had never known, because they had never once bothered to ask about my life or my work, was that I also held the commercial zoning rights to the surrounding 50 acres of prime real estate. I watched their eyes go wide with stunned, disbelieving shock as the realization hit them that I had been sitting on a vast hidden fortune for over 2 decades. They thought they were stealing a single custom-built house, but they had missed an entire empire sitting right beside it. I explained that, exactly 48 hours ago, while they were frantically attempting to forge my signature on a fraudulent bridge loan, I was seated in my lawyer's office executing a clean, airtight legal transfer. I told them that the 15-acre estate, the house, and the surrounding 50 acres of commercial land no longer belonged to me personally. I had sold every inch of it to a commercial trust that I control entirely. The inheritance they had worked so hard to steal simply did not exist anymore. It was gone, liquidated, transferred, and placed permanently beyond their reach. Nadell's designer purse slipped from her fingers and hit the marble floor with a hard thud that echoed down the corridor. She stared at me in total disbelief, her voice unsteady as she asked what I intended to do with all that land and all that money. I smiled. It was the first moment of genuine joy I had felt in 5 long years. I told them I was finally correcting my greatest architectural mistake. I explained that the commercial trust was already funding the complete demolition of the massive house they had tried to take from me. In its place, I was building a state-of-the-art architectural academy for underprivileged youth, a substantial modern campus where hard-working students could learn to design and build real solid foundations. And across the surrounding 50 acres, I was developing a thoughtfully designed, affordable housing project for families who actually understood the meaning of hard work and gratitude. I told them I was not simply liquidating my assets to spite them. I was taking the wealth they had felt so fiercely entitled to and building something with it that genuinely mattered. I was giving my fortune to complete strangers because those strangers had shown more integrity, more drive, and more basic decency than my own flesh and blood. Brennan stared blankly at the legal document in his shaking hands. The full suffocating weight of what he had lost finally landed on him. He had gambled away a vast multi-million-dollar inheritance chasing a fraudulent $500,000 loan, and he had come away with absolutely nothing. Tamsin let out a quiet, devastated sob as it settled over her that the luxurious, effortless life she had known was permanently finished. Holden stared at the floor, utterly defeated and completely humiliated. I told them they had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable source of funds. I told them they had mistaken my quiet grief for weakness and my boundless generosity for stupidity. I looked at all 4 of them, standing in that cold hallway, broke publicly exposed, legally stripped of every weapon they had carried in. I told them they were finally free to live their own lives, exactly as they had demanded on my birthday call. I advised them to learn to budget, and quickly because the master architect had closed the bank for good, and there would never be another deposit. The terror in their eyes was no longer something I felt any urge to relieve. For 38 years, I had placed myself between them and every consequence they ever deserved to face. I had paid the debts. I had smoothed over the failures. I had let them believe that their arrogant, reckless behavior was simply the natural privilege of their birthright. But standing there, looking at Brennan and Nadell, stripped of their unearned wealth and facing the cold, unforgiving world without a shield, I felt a deep and absolute sense of finality. I moved one step closer, making certain my voice was the only thing they could hold on to. I told Brennan that his failed companies and his bounced payrolls were no longer mine to cover. I told Nadell that her desperate need to impress wealthy strangers was a weight she would now carry entirely by herself. I looked directly into their wide, frightened eyes and watched the last traces of entitlement drain away completely. "You wanted your own lives?" I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly down the marble corridor. "You have them. Your debts are yours. Your failures are yours. I am no longer your safety net." I did not wait for their responses. I had no interest in hearing their desperate wailing or their hollow last-minute promises of change. I simply turned my back on them and walked down the long, echoing corridor toward the main exit of the downtown Richmond courthouse. Clifford kept pace right beside me, his heavy leather briefcase swinging slightly with each stride. I pressed through the massive brass doors and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps. The gray, overcast sky had finally cracked open, and a cold, sharp wind was cutting through the streets of Richmond. I pulled in a long breath of the freezing air and felt lighter than I had in decades. The immense grinding weight of trying to rescue people who were actively trying to ruin me was completely gone. I descended the concrete steps with the steady, even stride of a man who had finally set his own house in order. I could hear the frantic, heavy footsteps of my children crashing through the courthouse doors behind us, but I did not slow down, and I absolutely did not turn around. Out on those wide concrete steps, the brittle silence was shattered by Tamsin. Every trace of the pristine, polished socialite facade she had spent years constructing vanished at once, replaced by a shrill, piercing scream of pure panic. She understood with brutal clarity that the luxury life she had married into was gone for good. The offshore accounts were empty. The sprawling estate had been moved into a commercial trust. The limitless flow of money was finished. She turned on Brennan, her face twisted with vicious, unforgiving rage. She screamed that he was a pathetic, incompetent failure who had dragged her straight into a massive federal fraud investigation. She snatched her expensive designer handbag and hurled it at his chest landing with a loud, dull thud. Brennan reached for her, stammering and begging her to calm down, swearing he could find a bankruptcy lawyer and work some kind of way out of the wreckage. Tamsin knocked his hands away, entirely revolted by his helplessness. She yelled that she was going home to pack her things and file for divorce before the federal authorities could freeze whatever thin personal assets she had remaining. She spun on her heel, her heels cracking sharply against the concrete, and marched down the steps, leaving her husband standing there completely alone. The contagion of betrayal spread instantly to Nadell and Holden. Holden abandoned any concern for his collapsing marriage and turned all of his furious intensity onto his wife. He jabbed a shaking finger in Nadell's face, his voice fracturing with raw, uncontained panic. He screamed that her staggering incompetence had demolished his entire life. He shouted that the leasing company was probably hauling their pearl gray luxury SUV out of the courthouse parking lot at that very moment. He reminded her that their country club friends were going to read every word of this humiliating public spectacle and that they would be blacklisted from every elite social circle in the county. Nadell crumpled onto the hard, cold concrete steps, weeping with a loud and gut-wrenching despair. She begged Holden to stop screaming, clutching at his jacket, pleading with him to tell her how they were going to survive the weekend. Holden wrenched his jacket from her grip, his face flushed dark with rage. He told her she was going to have to find a minimum wage job and work out how to pay off $80,000 in high-interest credit card debt entirely on her own. I reached the foot of the long staircase where a sleek black town car was idling at the curb waiting for me and Clifford. The driver stepped out and opened the rear passenger door with quiet deference. Before I settled into the warm, still interior, I stopped. I turned back and looked up the wide flight of concrete steps one final time. It was a wretched, pitiable scene. The four adults who had entered the courthouse, projecting an aura of untouchable arrogance and supreme confidence, were now tearing into one another like starved, desperate animals. Brennan sat hunched on the steps, with his head buried in his hands, his business in ruins. His wife gone, his freedom dangling by a thin legal thread. Nadell was sobbing loudly on the bare concrete, begging a furious Holden not to walk away and leave her alone to face the mountain of debt they had built together. They were shredding each other apart in the cold gray morning, consumed entirely by the consequences of their own bottomless greed. The foundation they had constructed their whole lives upon was built from nothing but lies and stolen money. Now that the foundation had been ground to dust, the entire structure was caving inward, burying them under the weight of their own terrible choices. They were finally meeting the real unsparing world with not a single dollar of my money between them and it. I watched them for a few more seconds, feeling completely removed from their suffering. Then I eased into the leather seat of the town car and told the driver to take us home. 6 months passed. The deep freeze of winter had thawed away, giving way to a crisp, clear spring. But the turning of the seasons brought no warmth whatsoever to the hard, unrelenting reality my children were now living inside. In a cramped, windowless office building on the outskirts of Richmond, Brennan sat hunched over a cheap laminate desk. He was no longer wearing his bespoke charcoal suit that cost well over $3,000. Those had been sold off months ago to chip away at a fraction of his staggering corporate debt. In their place, he wore a faded gray button-down shirt with fraying at the collar. A heavy headset was clamped over his ears, tethering him to his small, isolated cubicle. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable tech visionary, pitching inflated startup ideas to wealthy investors in glass-walled boardrooms. He was an entry-level sales representative cold-calling irritated customers to peddle discounted office supplies. He stared blankly at the glowing spreadsheet on his monitor, eyes bloodshot and heavy with deep physical exhaustion. The sharp voice of his regional manager crackled over the intercom, demanding higher call volumes and threatening immediate termination for anyone who fell short of the daily quota. Brennan flinched at the sound. For 38 years, he had never answered to anyone. He had never feared losing his livelihood because his father had always been positioned right behind him with an open checkbook ready to catch him the instant he stumbled. Now there was no safety net. There was only the grinding, relentless pressure of scraping together just enough to cover his minimum monthly rent. He adjusted his headset, drew a slow, unsteady breath, and dialed the next number on his list. His voice cracked as he launched into his scripted pitch, swallowing every last shred of his pride as the customer on the other end hung up without a word. Brennan closed his eyes and pressed his face into his rough hands, absorbing the crushing, indifferent weight of the real world. For the very first time in his life, he was beginning to understand that building something genuine required actual sweat, not hollow, arrogant promises. Miles away in a neighborhood that her former country club friends would not even drive through, Nadell was experiencing her own spectacular fall from grace. She sat alone at a scratched, unsteady kitchen table inside a tiny one-bedroom apartment. The manicured lawns and heated pools she had taken for granted were entirely gone, traded for the constant rumble of elevated train tracks just beyond her thin, rattling window. Holden was gone, too. The moment the money vanished and the high-interest debt collectors started closing in, their marriage imploded completely. He had packed his bags and left, abandoning Nadell to face the full, devastating weight of the life they had built together, entirely on her own. She looked down at the stack of past-due utility bills fanned out across the cheap table. A basic plastic pen trembled in her hand as she tried to work out how she was going to afford groceries for the rest of the week. Her pearl gray luxury SUV had been repossessed months ago, seized from a public parking lot while she stood there and watched in total humiliation. She was now getting across town on a worn bus pass, riding to her new job as a junior receptionist at a low-tier commercial real estate firm. The commute was long and physically punishing, leaving her standing in cold rain alongside the everyday working people she had once openly looked down on. The very women she used to dismiss at her elite social gatherings were now the demanding clients she was obliged to bring coffee to. The humiliation burned in her chest every single day, but she had no alternative. She set her pen down and let her eyes move around the cramped, dim room, feeling the walls tighten around her. The silence of the small apartment was suffocating and entirely foreign to her. There were no extravagant parties to attend, no expensive dinners to document, and absolutely no father left to pull her back from the edge of her own poor choices. Nadell was finally learning the true value of a dollar because for the first time in her life, she was actually required to earn one. While my children were getting their long-overdue education in the real world, they had demanded so loudly I walked at a slow, unhurried pace through the quiet grounds of the local cemetery. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. I held a simple, beautiful bouquet of yellow roses in my right hand, moving with a steady, balanced stride. I no longer felt the heavy, suffocating sorrow that used to accompany these visits. What I felt instead was a profound and settled clarity, a deep and abiding peace. I reached the familiar marble headstone, resting in the shade of a great old oak tree. I knelt down gently and laid the yellow roses against the smooth, cool stone, letting my fingers trace the engraved letters of Lorinda's name. I drew a slow breath and let the stillness of the cemetery settle over me completely. I looked at the headstone and began to speak, my voice low and steady, carrying the weight of something finally resolved. I told her she had been right all along. I admitted that my endless generosity had never truly been about them. It had been a selfish need to play the hero in their story, and I had refused to see the damage it was doing to their foundations the whole time. I told my beautiful, clear-eyed wife that I had finally corrected my greatest architectural mistake. I explained that a sound structure cannot stand on a foundation of unearned privilege and endless rescue. It needs the heavy curing pressure of real consequences to harden its core. I told her I had torn out the rotted foundation of their deep entitlement and forced them to rebuild their lives from the bare ground up. I smiled, looking at the bright morning light filtering through the canopy of green leaves above, casting warm, golden patches across the polished marble. I told Lorinda that Brennan was finally learning the true worth of an honest day's work, and that Nadell was finally grasping what genuine independence actually costs. The demolition had been ugly, painful, and entirely without mercy, but it was the only way any new growth could take root. I straightened up, brushing the soft earth from my knees, feeling lighter and steadier than I had in years. I had stopped trying to protect them from the world, and in doing so, I had finally given them the chance to actually live in it. The warm afternoon sun fell across the cedar planks of my new back porch in a rich golden wash. I stood at the smooth wooden railing, a heavy stoneware mug of strong black coffee in my hand. The vast, sprawling mansion that Lorinda and I had raised together decades ago was entirely gone. In its place, an extraordinary transformation was taking shape. The deep rumble of diesel engines and the steady rhythm of steel hammers rang out across the valley. It was not the sound of destruction. It was the resonant living music of a genuine beginning. The Architectural Academy was climbing out of the earth, a bright skeleton of reinforced steel beams and broad glass panels catching the afternoon light. I watched the construction crews working with quiet purpose, pouring the concrete foundations that would soon anchor classrooms, design studios, and open workshops. This was no longer a hollow monument to my own pride or an oversized safety net for ungrateful adults. It was a real legacy. Spread across the wide wooden drafting table on the porch lay dozens of architectural blueprints, their edges lifting gently in the spring breeze. Gathered around the table stood 5 young, sharp-eyed students. They were nothing like the people who had once filled my home. These young men and women wore no expensive designer labels and drove no luxury vehicles. They came in faded jeans, scuffed work boots, and plain cotton shirts. They had come from hard neighborhoods and difficult beginnings, carrying nothing but a fierce, unshakable hunger to build something better for themselves. A young man named Dio ran a calloused finger along the precise lines of a structural diagram and put a highly technical question to me about load-bearing distribution. I set my stoneware mug down on the railing and walked over to the drafting table. I did not hand him the answer. I guided him carefully, pointing out the stress factors and material limits, pressing him to work the structural puzzle through on his own. I watched his brow crease in deep concentration, and then a sudden clean spark of understanding lit up his eyes. He solved it entirely by himself. The honest, unguarded pride that broke across his face was worth more to me than any check I had ever written. For decades, I had poured my wealth into a bottomless well of family entitlement. I had written check after check to absorb Brennan's massive corporate failures. I had quietly funded Nadell's desperate need to hold her place in elite social circles. I had convinced myself that shielding them from every hardship was the highest form of a father's love. I believed that engineering a smooth, frictionless life for them was my primary obligation. But standing here mentoring these genuinely driven young people, I finally understood the depth of the damage I had done to my own flesh and blood. These students treated the materials they worked with as something precious because they knew exactly what it cost to obtain them. They valued my time because the knowledge behind it actually meant something to them. They did not look at me expecting a handout. They looked at me hoping to learn how to lay their own solid foundations. I was finally putting my energy into people who wanted to learn to stand, not into people who simply expected to be carried. The afternoon drifted slowly into a cool, clear evening. The construction crews shut down their heavy equipment, and the deep rumbling of engines faded out across the hills. The students gathered their graphite pencils, rolled their blueprints, and tucked away their notebooks, offering genuine, unhurried thanks before they left. I watched them move down the long gravel drive, talking with easy animation about what they were going to build next. They carried a raw, durable resilience that my own children had long since let slip away. I knew that Brennan and Nadell were out there somewhere in the cold, unsparing world, straining to cover their rent and grinding through exhausting entry-level work. I knew they were tasting the bitter, humbling reality of failure, the brutal discipline of living paycheck to paycheck. It was a hard, grinding process, but it was the only one that could do them any real good. I stepped back to the edge of the cedar porch and looked out over the full sweep of the 50 acres. The affordable housing project was already taking form in the distance, raising safe and well-made homes for families who had actually earned what they had. I lifted my stoneware mug and drew a slow, deep sip of the dark, bitter coffee. The cool evening air moved across my face, carrying the clean scent of turned earth and pine. I thought about Lorinda and her steady, unsparing wisdom. I thought about how many years it had taken me to hear what she had been telling me all along. Real love is never about bankrolling someone's bottomless appetite for more. Real love is not about slipping cushions beneath them every time they stumble or papering over their failures with a checkbook. Real love is having the immense, heartbreaking courage to step out of the way and let them fall. It is allowing them to meet the hard ground so they can finally learn to absorb the impact, tend their own wounds, and find their feet under themselves. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the hill country sky in deep shades of violet and indigo. The warm lights of my new, smaller home came on, casting a steady, welcoming glow across the wooden deck. I stood there entirely alone, and I did not feel a trace of loneliness. I had finally put down a burden that had never truly been mine to carry. The frantic, incessant calls demanding money were gone for good. The corrosive, exhausting manipulation had lifted completely. I leaned against the railing and breathed in the cool night air, and I simply smiled. I closed my eyes and let the deep, unbroken quiet of a genuinely peaceful life settle over me completely. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I want to say thank you, truly. Stories like this one don't leave you easily, and they're not meant to. Looking back on everything Gerald carried and everything he finally set down, what strikes me most is how long, quiet endurance can be mistaken for weakness. He gave for decades. He absorbed and covered and kept the peace. And the ones he gave the most to were the ones who eventually tried to take what little dignity he had left. I believe God has a way of moving things into place when we have finally done all we can do on our own. And Gerald's story is proof that the Lord's timing, however slow it feels, does not miss. Here is what I take from a story like this, the kind of father story that stays with you long after it's over. First, generosity without limits is not love. It is a slow way of teaching someone that they never have to stand on their own. Second, when someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe what you see, not what you hoped they would become. Third, real legacy is not what you leave to people who expect it. It is what you build for people who will honor it. Fourth, protecting your peace is not cruelty. Sometimes stepping aside is the most courageous thing a parent can do. If these grandpa revenge stories speak to something you have lived or witnessed, I want to hear from you. Leave a thought in the comments. Your story matters too. And if you know someone carrying a weight like Gerald's, share this with them. It might be exactly what they need today. Subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so these stories find their way to you. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.